This is session 4, Insights and New Frontiers for Understanding Global Health. This panel will explore the need for and the emergence of new health metrics and insights into global well-being, drawing on the findings of the Global Flourishing study to explore how innovative measures of health are reshaping our understanding of world health across cultures and context. We're going to have 3 participants in this panel. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all of them, and then that gives them free rein to do whatever they want to do for the next hour and a half. It's Bryon Johnson, who serves as Distinguished Professor of Social Sciences at Baylor University. He's a founding director of the Baylor Institute for Studies of Religion. He's a faculty affiliate of the Human Flourishing Study at Harvard University and is the founding director also of Baylor's Institute for Global Flourishing. Tyler J. VanderWeele is the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and Director of the Human Flourishing Program and co-director of the Initiative on Health, Spirituality, and Religion at Harvard University. John Clifton, the third participant on this panel, serves as the CEO of Gallup, the global analytics and advisory firm. His mission is to connect 1 billion individuals with their unique strengths, assist organizations in fostering thriving workplaces, and help 8 billion of the world's citizens be heard through the Gallup World Poll, a century-long project spanning over 150 countries. So a distinguished panel, and I'm happy to welcome Bryon and Tyler initially. Come on up. Let's welcome them together.
Well, it's great to be here with you, and the way we're going to kick this panel off is John and I are going to have a little bit of a conversation about where the Global Flourishing Study came from. What are the origins of it? How did it come about? And after that, we're going to introduce Tyler to come up and to give you some of the key findings from Wave 1 and Wave 2 of the Global Flourishing Study, and give you an update on the study more generally. And then the 3 of us will have a conversation about possibilities, what lies ahead for the research that we're now doing and the Global Flourishing Study itself. So how does that sound? So John, if I go back to 2000, I lived in the city of Philadelphia and I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and I met this person that was just bigger than life, George Gallup Jr., at an event. And I thought, wow, that's George Gallup. And someone introduced me, and he's the nicest person I'd ever met. And we just struck up a conversation. And I said, I love reading the Gallup poll. And George was a person of deep faith and was one of the people behind the idea that we should be asking people questions on religion. And so I met George, and he said, you know, we should do a survey together. And so we did. We did a number of those surveys together. So it was great working with him for a number of years. And then in 2004, I came to Baylor. And when I got here, George said to me, you really do need to reach out to Jim Clifton, who's the chairman of Gallup, the CEO of Gallup. And I'm passing the baton to him. You should start working with him. And that all happened. And I then met John, the son of Jim Clifton, who would later become the CEO. And so we've been working together for almost 20 years. We've done many, many projects together. It's been a fantastic relationship, and John's just become a dear friend. And we had dinner last night, and we were reminiscing about a funny story. So here's the story. I asked John to be a non-resident senior fellow at our Institute for Studies of Religion here at Baylor University. I don't know how many years ago it was. He goes, you want me to be a fellow at Baylor? I said, sure, this would be outstanding if you'd say yes. He said yes. And so this is an invitation. It's a courtesy appointment. We do it all the time in the academy. And a lot of people wear that proudly. Other people don't put it on their resume. They don't make much of it. But I remember seeing his bio on the internet, and it had that he was a senior fellow at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion. And I thought, I wonder if that gets him into all kinds of trouble, because he's always traveling all over the world to all these countries where they do all this survey work. So last year I was in Washington, I always forget to ask him this question, so I said, I'm going to ask him about it. So, John, you want to take it from there?
Byron said in your bio, it mentions senior fellow at Baylor. Do you ever get asked about it? And I said, I can't believe you asked me that. And he said, why? And I said, because of everything that's included in there. If I don't know if I'm giving a speech somewhere or meeting a group of new people, it is the number one thing that I get asked about. Not where I went to grad school, not the fact that I authored a book, everything that's in there. That is the number one thing that I get asked about. I even had a really influential American ask me to go to dinner one time, and I think the whole reason he was doing it is because I was connected to Baylor, and he started referring to a gentleman named Dr. Johnson. And as I'm sitting there at the dinner, I think to myself, I have no idea who he's talking about. Who is Dr. Johnson? And he said, well, he's doing his prison work, and he goes there, and he brings religion in, and it seems to have these remarkable effects. And as he's saying it, I'm thinking to myself, he's talking about Byron. It's like, who calls him Dr. Johnson? But anyway, no, it's a great honor to be a part of the Baylor tribe. So thank you for that, Byron.
Thank you. Well, it's been so much fun over the years to work with Gallup on so many different projects. I've always loved their mission. Their mission is, how do we give a voice to every person on the planet? And so I've always appreciated the work that they do, and it's always been a joy of my life to be affiliated with Gallup. And but let's fast forward the conversation, John. We've had all kinds of things that we've done together, and plots and strategies. But if we fast forward to 2018, Tyler VanderWeele hosted a conference for a small group of scholars at Harvard on flourishing, but everybody from different disciplines. And he asked us to basically come spend a couple of days there together and learn from each other. And so Tyler and I had not met in person, but we had talked on the phone and we had exchanged emails. So that was our first time to meet, was in 2018, October. And Tyler gave a presentation on the importance of doing causal research. And basically the message was, we can do better, we should do better as scholars. And his talk was really kind of convicting, because most of my research was correlational, it wasn't causal. And I thought, what might we do that would be better? So during that 3-day conference, Tyler and I dreamed up the Global Flourishing Study. I told Tyler, I've got this great relationship with Jim and John Clifton, and what if we were to propose the possibility of doing a panel study much larger than anything had ever been done in the world before? And but flourishing would be the framework. And so as Tyler and I thought about it, we thought if we could get a foundation or two to go with us to a meeting with Gallup, that might be helpful. So that was the seed of the Global Flourishing Study that was planted in October and November of 2018, and Gallup took a couple of months to ponder the idea to see if it was possible to do. They said, we've wondered about doing something that would be more global. We've done panel studies in a number of places, but to do something like this would be a big lift. And so after maybe a couple of months, your team came back and said, we can do it. And so Tyler and I spent about 3 years trying to get that thing across the finish line, and in 2021, the Global Flourishing Study was officially funded by a group of foundations. It was too large for one group to fund, and that led to us doing a pilot project around the world in 22 countries. I remember, John, you and I were talking about it, and you said, can you go with me to all these countries? To all 22 countries, and to do cognitive interviews. And I remember thinking, thank goodness for COVID, because it was my out. I didn't have to go to all 22 countries with the Gallup team, but in fact, we did do a year-long series of pilot projects in each of the countries as an entree to the actual launch of the Global Flourishing Study. And so that's just a little bit of the background. John, what I'd like for you to do is to give us a little bit of a background of Gallup itself. Sure. You've been at it for so long, the company.
Maybe as I do that, I just want to make another comment, because it's really extraordinary when Bryon or Tyler says what this is or what it is that they're working on. The ambition behind it is utterly remarkable. And I'll sum it up this way, and I'll try to answer your question and explain this at the same time. But the Gallup organization, so we were founded in 1935, and actually our history feels a lot more like it was politics. Interestingly enough, there was a fascinating interview where Edward R. Murrow, it's so dated, Edward R. Murrow actually has a cigarette that he has in the interview with George Gallup. It's amazing. I can imagine today a journalist having a cigarette, smoking while they're interviewing somebody. But they look at George Gallup and they say to him, of everything that you've studied, what is it that interested you the most? And George Gallup actually says happiness. And he launches into this thing about how he was doing some studies to understand what a great life looked like. And so separately throughout the history of our organization, we started to do that. So if you've heard of the World Happiness Report, it's actually something that Gallup does. So it's a group of academics that takes our data, they label it happiness, and they rank who the happiest countries in the world are. And interestingly, as a result of that work, one year, the New York Times in the United States took a sample of like 300,000 of our interviews, and they looked at every demographic cut. So they went to, what's the happiest state? They found it's Hawaii. Religion, what's the happiest religion? They found it's, if you're Jewish. Income, over 120,000. What's your profession? Small business owner. You have to be married. They went through this entire list. If you do race, Asian. So they had to find a Jewish Asian man making over 120,000 that's married, a business owner living in Hawaii, and they found him. The New York Times, I think they called and then showed up to his house, and he said, "Is this a prank?" And they said, "No, we're serious. We want to know, what is it like to be the happiest man in America?" So, of course, then he takes on that perspective and starts sharing his thoughts, and he becomes an internet sensation. The whole world says, here's America's happiest man. And he said he got inundated with phone calls. And at first he thought it was just absolutely fascinating and kind of, got a kick out of it. And he said, and then it became tragic because so many people were calling asking if there was a shortcut to happiness. Like, what's the answer? Because this man must have it. And I thought about it, and even though we've had thousands of years of philosophers opining on this particular issue, or researchers and great minds like George Gallup trying to come up with the answer, we still don't have it. What is the secret to a great life? And so when these two talk about this project that they dreamt up for 3 days and went and fundraised for it, what they're actually talking about is they have now gone out to these near 24 countries of everything that they're writing about, of everything that they're researching on, everything that, and we are so honored to be a part of it. They're trying to answer one question: what does it mean to have such an amazing life? That's what it means to flourish. And one thing, as Bryon mentioned, which was an unlock for Bryon and I as well, is Tyler said we got to get closer to cause. What actually causes somebody to have a better life? And that is the underlying point of this study, which I find absolutely remarkable. And it is ambitious. I don't know if we're ever going to get to the final answer, but we're going to get a lot closer because of it.
Yeah, I remember last April when we released 36 papers in a special collection of papers in Washington, D.C., so almost a year ago. After that, we had a luncheon to kind of celebrate. You were
We actually
you
don't know
were
where I was.
globetrotting in Europe
Yeah.
somewhere. You couldn't be there, but your dad was there. And your dad, I asked him to make some comments, and he said, well, when Bryon and Tyler came up with this idea, I thought, there's no way in the world this is going to happen. I'm thinking, Jim never said that to me. He always was encouraging me, but he's coming clean finally. He never thought it would happen, so it was kind of interesting to hear him say how delighted he was, that we've kind of pulled this thing off.
You know, just to kind of put a finer point on why Gallup would hear this from these two and go, that's insane what you're suggesting. And I'll explain it in the best that I can. So, you know, we do some pretty extreme things at Gallup. I mean, now we do surveys in a minimum of 140 countries per year. And in 100 of those countries, they are face-to-face interviews. Why? Because people everywhere don't have phones or access to the internet. So if we want to make sure that they have an equal chance of being selected, we have to do face-to-face interviewing. So we have a network of about 5,000 to 6,000 interviewers that walk the planet to make sure that when we knock on someone's door, that it is available to them in the near 140 countries or languages that we make it available in various dialects, etc. If it would have been that kind of study, that wouldn't have been challenging. Here's the twist that makes it so nearly impossible. When we show up to those homes, we say to them, do you mind being part of a panel where we can kind of reach out to you anytime throughout the rest of your life? Imagine someone showing up or calling and asking if you would take part in a research study that just sort of never ends. And imagine what the chances are that somebody's going to tell you yes to that. And so that means we have to knock on thousands more doors or to make even thousands more phone calls in order to find those people that will actually participate on this ongoing period of time. Because what these two are trying to accomplish is, as we follow them throughout their lives, and there have been a few true panels, you know, like the famous one at Harvard where they tracked people for about 80 years. I think there was one where they just reached out to young men in the community, and then there was another one of graduates. It was one of the most famous panel studies ever, and it actually showed the importance of social relationships in life. But this one is far more ambitious because a lot of the challenges that exist with panels is that they're American only. And now research all knows Americans are weird, which I guess we didn't need a lot of research to know that how weird we are. But of course, weird is an acronym that, you know, so much of the research is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, whatever the acronym stands for. But this goes to an extent that has ultimately never been tried at this level before. That's why it's so ambitious.
Well, that's just a little bit
Wait, can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Why would you do something that insane?
Well, I think it was inspired by God. I didn't go to that meeting at Harvard with this on my mind. I listened to Tyler's talk, and during the break, I had this idea. And so, you know, I cornered Tyler, and he didn't punch me, and he just said, I don't know if it's possible, Byron. And if it were, I don't know that we could ever get the money. But he goes, I don't think there's any harm in going down to Gallup and running it by them. And so I remember, because I had some stock at Gallup, that I could convene the group. And so I remember you had all the methodology people in the room when we pitched the idea. And I could see Rajesh over there thinking, I was made for this. So yeah, I you know, I can say that here. It's a Christian university. I really have felt like the project has been inspired by God.
You're one of the most prolific fundraisers I've ever met. But why? You know, I think you've raised almost $50 million for this work. Why do you think those people give to this? You know, I mean, the funders in the world, they could put their name on a building at a university. They could. There's a million things that they could do. Why would they give to this?
Well, probably Tyler. I think Tyler and I are so different, but we're a pretty compelling group together. And I think that Baylor being so eager to have a project, a landmark project like this here, was a part of it. And then the Harvard Shield and Tyler meant so much. And I think when people thought, if Gallup is entertaining the idea of, putting their full support behind something like this, maybe it's worth investing in. And, we had some ambitious goals, but we've far surpassed all of them already in terms of what we had hoped to accomplish in terms of publications. And we're really just kind of getting started, John. So with that, why don't I introduce one of my best friends ever, the real reason why we got this study funded, Dr. Tyler VanderWeele.
Well, it's always wonderful to revisit the origins of something one cares deeply about. And as both Bryon and John indicated, when the idea first arose, I really did think, this is pie in the sky. Go ahead, Bryon, bring it up at Gallup, and we'll see what happens. And it was only months later that I thought, maybe there is a chance. And I will say it was only possible because of the extraordinary work and infrastructure that Gallup built, the incredible partnership and friendship that Bryon had with the Cliftons, and that relationship of trust and respect. And finally, the relationship that over time Bryon and I developed, that deep friendship when things seemed impossible, and that happened with some frequency. It required that friendship, that mutual support. When one of us was feeling discouraged, the other one was there to try to encourage and press forward. And so I do think we don't often talk about the relational aspects of research, but I think it is critical. And it was an extraordinarily important part of the process and an extraordinary experience as well. So very grateful to Bryon, to John, to Gallup to make this possible. We'll come back to big picture and sort of envisioning what the implications of the global flourishing study and the flourishing movement might be, but it seemed good to also give an overview with regard to the frameworks we've been using and some of the main results as well. And then, again, want to acknowledge this partnership not only between Baylor and Harvard and Gallup, but also the Center for Open Science and all of our funders, the 3 Templeton Philanthropies and many other foundations that have made this work possible. So I'll give an overview of kind of the notion of flourishing and the measures that we've been using. I'll talk about the Global Flourishing Study and some of the results and how that has given us insights into pathways for flourishing as we try to move towards conclusions about causation. I'll then briefly move to how we might extend this thinking in practice to other practical context and offer a few concluding remarks before we open it up for further discussion. Some of the papers in the Nature Springer Special Collection that I'll be drawing from are here on this slide, but you can go to the website and find about 80 others already just in this last year that have come out of the Global Flourishing Study, with another 100 or so now underway. What is flourishing? Well, the working definition of flourishing that we've been using is the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context, communities, environments in which that person lives. So understood thus, it's really all-inclusive. All aspects of a life are good. It's also multidimensional. We may be flourishing in some ways and not others. We may be struggling with our health but have good relationships. Or we may feel we are sacrificing some degree of personal happiness for trying to accomplish some important purpose. Flourishing is also an ideal. It's not something we ever attain perfectly in this life. There's always room for improvement. Flourishing also includes one's communities, contexts, and environments, both because those communities shape one's own well-being, but also because one participates in the common good of the community. The community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing. And so this broad, expansive notion is arguably what we're seeking as individuals and really should be seeking as a society. With something so all-encompassing it's difficult to know where to begin or what to measure, and unquestionably there are different emphases and nuances across cultures and religions and philosophies, but I think a good place to begin is what may be held in common across different understandings of flourishing. And so what we'd argue is that whatever else flourishing might include, any reasonable understanding of flourishing would include the following 5 domains of life as well. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, but whatever else flourishing might include, it would include these 5 also. These are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that these exhaust flourishing, but each is a part of it. I think each of these domains satisfies the following 2 criteria. Each of these is nearly universally desired, and we now have empirical data to support that claim from the Global Flourishing Study itself. And each is an end in itself. It's sought for its own sake. It's not merely a means to some other end. And I think those 2 criteria, being nearly universally desired, being an end, can help shape consensus around what we might measure, at least to begin with, in our understanding of flourishing. So central to this Global Flourishing Study, though this is not all that the study contains, as I'll comment on shortly, but central to this study is this core flourishing measure, where we've taken 2 questions in each of these 5 domains, drawn principally from the existing well-being literature on measurement literature on well-being, questions that have received some degree of empirical validation and are in relatively widespread use. These 10 questions are as follows. First, in that happiness domain, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? From 0, not at all satisfied, to 10, completely satisfied. This is perhaps one of the most widely used well-being questions in the literature. It's been used by the OECD, by the UK's annual survey, and some years by Gallup in this year's US National Health Interview survey. And then we supplement that with something more affective in nature. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? From 0, extremely unhappy, to 10, extremely happy. A second domain, physical and mental health. These are just standard self-report health questions from the US General Social Survey and the World Health Organization's Mental Health Survey. In general, how would you rate your physical health? 0 to 10. How would you rate your overall mental health? 0 to 10. Third domain, meaning and purpose. First question, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? From 0, not at all worthwhile, to 10, completely worthwhile. This question also is very widely used in the well-being literature, once again by the OECD, by the UK's annual survey, by many cohort studies. And then we supplement that with something more cognitive in nature. I understand my purpose in life. From 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree. Fourth domain, character and virtue. First question, trying in some crude way to get at notions of practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. From 0, not at all true of me, to 10, completely true of me. And then second question, intended in some crude way to try to get at notions of fortitude and temperance. I'm always able to give up some happiness now for greater happiness later. And then the fifth domain, close social relationships. These 2 questions were taken from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of short social connectedness assessments. First question, I'm content with my friendships and relationships. From 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree, trying to get at sort of the quantity of those relationships. And then my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, trying to get at the quality of those relationships. We do typically report results separately across these domains, because as we'll be seeing shortly, dynamics can be quite different across these flourishing domains. And for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, happiness and health fell much more dramatically than did meaning or character, or even relationships. We'll sometimes average these 10 questions for a crude assessment of flourishing, but really this should be understood as nothing more than the average of those 5 more meaningful domain-specific measures. And then we'll typically supplement these 10 questions with 2 others on financial and material stability as important means to sustain those other ends. So these 2 questions drawn from the empirical financial well-being literature is how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? From 0, worry all the time, to 10, do not worry at all. How often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? Again, we'll typically report this domain separately as well. Sometimes we'll average the 12 questions together for a more secure measure of flourishing, perhaps less satisfactory conceptually, since financial resources are means, not ends, but arguably more satisfactory in practice, indicating flourishing over a longer period of time. I'll soon talk about some of the research uses, and of course focusing on the global flourishing study that we've made of this measure, but I think it can also be helpful for self-assessment, either at the individual level or at the community level. An opportunity to reflect on what's going well in life and what might not be, where one might try to improve things. Can be helpful in reflecting on changes one wants to make. When taken repeatedly over time at the individual level or community level, you can see what's improving, what's staying the same, what may be declining. So some of the sample feedback that we've had when we've used this in various workplace or community or educational or clinical settings, some of the questions made me stop and think. It was pretty eye-opening to see the areas I really need to work on. Relief that someone is asking, I want help in certain areas. Slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose. Missing a greater purpose, need to reach out to help more and give back. One woman in a workplace setting after going through these questions said, I've been wrestling with whether to join this volunteering activity for several months. After going through these and realizing I don't have much purpose, I've decided to commit. So the very active measurement can in some sense be an intervention. And in that regard, I'm in fact going to briefly pause here for 2 minutes and give you all an opportunity to reflect on your own lives. Don't worry, we won't be collecting data here and now, but again, we'll just spend 2 minutes reflecting on these questions. And then we'll move on to the implementation of the Global Flourishing Study. I realize 2 minutes is not a lot of time, but perhaps this is prompted thoughts or reflections to return to later. We have now embedded this measure in various workplace, cohort study, clinical, academic, school, randomized trial settings, but it's been taken by millions of participants, but unquestionably the largest data collection and the most important data collection effort to date has been this Global Flourishing Study. So as indicated previously, this is a study of over 200,000 individuals in 22 geographically, culturally, religiously diverse countries, spanning all 6 populated continents, with nationally representative sampling in each country. And then the real innovation, the real challenge, as John had indicated, is we're following the same sample of 200,000 individuals once a year, intended 5 years and maybe more of data collection to try to understand the distribution of flourishing, across these different countries, but also over time the determinants. What is giving rise to, what is causing flourishing? And for that, we really do need to gain such insights, that longitudinal panel data on the same sample of individuals. Only 22 countries, but these 22 countries together represent nearly 2/3 of the world's population. So we're gaining tremendous insight into this. This is an open access data resource hosted by the Center for Open Science. The first wave of data from 2023 was released in February of 24. The second wave was released in April of last year. And the third wave of data is now available as of this past Monday. So we're moving more and more towards not just how is flourishing distributed, but what causes it. In the first wave of data collection, we also looked at flourishing within each of these countries, averaging those 12 questions. The study itself has a lot more than that. There's 109 questions in the survey, including other aspects of well-being not covered by those 12 flourishing questions, along with social, political, economic, community, religious, spiritual, family determinants, potential determinants of flourishing. But if you just take those 12 questions and you average them in each of the 22 countries, and you report the means, the results look maybe a little different than what one might have expected, and a little different from the World Happiness Report as well, which I'll be coming back to. When averaged over those 12 questions, the country reporting the highest flourishing is Indonesia, 8.1 out of 10, followed by Israel, Philippines, Mexico, Poland, all of those above 7.5. Most of the countries really fall right around 7. Numbers 9 through 20 are all essentially between 6.8 and 7.2, right around 7. We probably shouldn't make too much of those differences, given matters of translation and interpretation. But there are a couple of outliers. At the bottom, Turkey at 6.3 and Japan at about 5.9. And then again, some outliers at the top as well. Indonesia, Israel, Philippines, Mexico, and Poland all reporting above 7.5. And I'll come back to differences with the World Happiness Report shortly, where they're simply getting at different aspects. It's not that one's right or one's wrong. They're getting at different aspects of well-being. Also, just with the first wave of data, more descriptive statistics aggregated over the 22 countries, men and women report roughly similar flourishing scores. But there is variation across countries. In Japan, women report considerably higher flourishing than men. In Brazil, it's the reverse. Men report considerably higher flourishing than women. One of the interesting patterns with this study has been with age, and the traditional well-being curves with age, generally using happiness or life satisfaction or life evaluation, are typically U-shaped, with younger people and older people reporting higher, and those in midlife perhaps struggling with young children and aging parents and career challenges reporting lower. But what seems to have been happening over time is that left part of the U has been flattening. Young people are not doing as well as they used to be, as I think also came up in Jean Twenge's talk, for example. And we find that in many of the countries. Certainly when aggregated across the 12 questions in the 22 countries, we find flourishing is increasing with age. And we find that in many specific countries as well, including not just the United States, but also Australia, Argentina, Brazil, Sweden, the UK. In all of these countries, young people really aren't doing well. Flourishing is increasing with age. This is not the case everywhere. India and Egypt, with these flourishing questions, still manifest somewhat more U-shaped patterns. And in Poland and Tanzania, flourishing is decreasing with age. So again, quite a bit of variability across countries. And so some of what we'll be trying to do in the years ahead is to unpack and understand why that might be so. Replicating a lot of prior research, but now with a more global scope, we've also found that those who are employed, educated, married, and religious tend to report higher flourishing scores than those who are not. But not in all countries. In India and Tanzania, single individuals report higher flourishing than married individuals. The pattern with education tends to be that flourishing increases with increasing education, but not everywhere. In Hong Kong and Australia, it's the opposite. Flourishing is decreasing in education. Why might that be so? Again, these are things that we hope to unpack with further waves of data. Another, I think, important result from this study is different countries are flourishing in different ways. In rich, developed, high-income countries, one tends to find higher levels of overall life evaluation and higher levels of financial security. But patterns are different with meaning, with purpose, with pro-social character, with relationships. Their middle-income countries tend to report higher than high-income countries. And it's here where the differences with the World Happiness Report come into play. They use a question, which I think is a good question, on a ladder. Where would you put your life if you viewed the 10th step of the ladder as the best possible life and the bottom step, 0, is the worst possible life? Where would you put your life? I think it's a good, reasonable question, and rich, developed countries tend to report higher on that. So in the World Happiness Report, you'll often find the Scandinavian countries reporting very highly. In our study, we have Indonesia, Philippines reporting amongst the highest. Why is that? Well, it's because they're reporting higher in meaning, higher in pro-social character, higher in relationships. And we're averaging all of these. So as one particularly striking example, again, Sweden does very well in the World Happiness Report. We include that ladder life evaluation question in the Global Flourishing Study as well. And if you just look at that, Sweden does very well on that. They're second of the 22 countries. But if you look at meaning in life, they're 19th of the 22. And so I think this raises, and to my mind, perhaps one of the most important questions from the Global Flourishing Study is how can we carry out economic development, which is unquestionably important, but how can we do so without compromising meaning, relationships, and pro-social orientation? As was noted previously, we're also trying to use this data over time to gain insights into what is shaping flourishing and how can we support flourishing. From a prior literature review looking at potential pathways to flourishing, pathways that are relatively common in the population and that have large effects across those flourishing domains, across happiness, health, meaning, character, and relationships. What has led to, based on the most rigorous studies, a number, I think, of critical pathways: family, work, education, religious community. These are all common in the population and have important effects on flourishing. And so from a public health or population health perspective, if something's common and has large effects, it's going to shape population outcomes. And so if we use the flourishing lens to look at this, we're led to these various things: family, work, education, religious community. Not that these are exhaustive. Deep engagement in the arts, for example, might be very important in someone's life, but perhaps less common in populations. The argument's not that they're exhaustive, nor that they're necessary for an individual. An individual could flourish in the absence of one or more of those pathways. Rather, the argument's that each of these powerfully affects those flourishing domains, is common in the population. So if efforts were made to participate in and to support these various pathways at the individual and societal level, flourishing would increase. So as a review from 2017 and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, those little numbers are references to more rigorous studies supporting these pathways, from the pathways on the left side to the flourishing domains on the right side. In some cases, evidence was well supported, and in other cases, only 1 or 2 studies that were more rigorous and longitudinal in design could be found. But what the Global Flourishing Study is doing is adding further evidence for each and every one of those pathways, not just in one country where most of the studies are done, but in 22 countries representing 2/3 of the world's population. Even with the first wave of data, we had retrospective assessments of these pathways in childhood. And so we were able to create sort of a synthetic longitudinal study. How do various childhood factors shape adult flourishing? Once again, supporting these pathways. And now that we're moving to waves 2 and 3 of the study, we're able to look at the same dynamics with regard to adult life. So this is not yet published, but some of the initial results in wave 2, this will be out later this year, which allow us to look at kind of wave 1 predictors of wave 2 flourishing. This is over a relatively short period of time, just 1 year. But what we found after controlling for a host of other factors is that some of the most important 1-year predictors of wave 2 flourishing are, perhaps unsurprisingly, and John touched upon this already with the Harvard longitudinal study, are social connection, social support, social connectedness, a sense of belonging within one's country affects those various flourishing domains, not just social connectedness in wave 2, but also happiness and health and meaning. We've found amongst the various factors regarding social participation, marriage and religious service attendance are the two that most strongly affect subsequent flourishing a year later. With regard to a host of different character assessments, we found that the most powerful predictors, at least 1 year out, are hope, showing love and care towards others, and being completely committed to pursuing the good, even in difficult and challenging circumstances. Health is obviously important, but we've found particular salience to the more subjective aspects and functional aspects of health. Are there limitations? Are you being limited in your activities because of your health? To what extent are you in pain? With the financial indicators, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, we found subjective financial security more important in shaping flourishing, at least a year later, than the objective factors. Maybe the objective factors take more time to play out. We'll learn more in the years ahead, but at least 1 year out, it was really that sense of subjective financial security that was most relevant for also shaping happiness or meaning or relationships later on. And so these analyses give some indication where we might target interventions to improve societal flourishing. Can we promote love within society? Can we promote a sense of social connectedness? Can we reduce loneliness within society? If we can, this will affect not just those outcomes, but a host of others as well. Don't have time to go into details here, but there is considerable heterogeneity across countries, and so which strategies are universal and which should be tailored to each context really does need more unpacking, and we are in the process of doing that with this second wave of data. We do now have, as of Monday, access to the third wave of data, which will allow us to move yet closer to causal conclusions, looking at changes in these exposures over time and how that affects subsequent outcomes, being able to control for a host of factors in wave 1 as well. So again, we're trying to move from description, which we've done and which has provided tremendous insight already, to questions of causation, of determinants, and of what we might do at a societal policy level to promote flourishing. I think some of the critical questions that have arisen so far is that we've seen young people in many countries are not flourishing. Are we sufficiently investing in the well-being of youth and in future generations? As I noted earlier, we've seen meaning, relationship quality, social character are often reported higher in middle-income countries than high-income countries. Again, how can we carry out economic development without compromising meaning, purpose, relationships, character? We've seen in sort of the childhood studies that religious service attendance is strongly associated with well-being across all of these various outcomes and across these countries. Might it be the case that the lower levels of more humanistic, eudaimonic forms of well-being, like meaning or relationships or character, in economically advanced nations, might that be connected to declining religious participation in those communities? Are we neglecting or perhaps sometimes even suppressing powerful spiritual pathways to flourishing? So again, I think the study itself raises questions for societal reflection. I think it also suggests we need to be more active in promoting flourishing in these contexts and local communities that are so powerful that the research points towards. And so I think we should be using these same flourishing assessments that we've been using across countries in more local contexts. I think even the very act of measurement, as I said earlier, sort of constitutes an intervention. It can reveal what's going well and what's not, what requires attention. It can change priorities. It affects what we discuss, what we aim for, policies put in place to achieve those aims. It can motivate action. And so some of the work we're doing now and hope to do in the future is to bring these flourishing frameworks to these more local communities, to universities, to schools, to religious communities. We've begun an academic flourishing initiative, trying to take these flourishing frameworks and also looking at community well-being and student formation into universities. We have about 20 universities participating in this year, including Baylor University, looking at how flourishing is changing over the 4 years of undergraduate education. Looking at metrics not just concerning GPA and graduation rates and job placement, which are important, but whether students view the university itself as contributing to their own development, their own flourishing, their growth in wisdom, their capacity for leadership or to work across differences. And so trying to, again, bring these frameworks to empower communities and universities and colleges to promote student formation and academic flourishing. Doing something similar with schools and networks of schools, carrying out these flourishing assessments, character assessments, community well-being assessments, kind of adapting these measures for 9 to 11-year-olds or 12 to 17-year-olds, kind of keeping the domains but changing the questions to be more age appropriate, to again identify what is going well and what is not, and how things might be improved. We've partnered with the OECD in developing a framework for this and are now working with networks of schools to try to carry this out. Often the results are encouraging. On the whole, in our data collection so far with universities, university students are flourishing more than is the case for average 18 to 24-year-olds. But they can also point to challenges. One university we've been working with, the largest fall from freshman year to senior year was, to what extent has university life helped you to become more honest? And it should be distressing that every year students said less and less. What might we do to counter those changes? In collaboration, again, with Baylor and Bryon and for studies of religion, we're also trying to bring these frameworks into churches. To have data collection empower the flourishing of church communities, assessing both individual flourishing, but also flourishing as congregations, as communities. And finally, the contribution of the churches to the broader communities, to those outside the church communities. By identifying the strengths and areas for growth, one can help churches also to flourish. So I do think the research gives us tremendous insight, raises societal questions, but also provides frameworks which we can use in more specific local contexts. So in conclusion, I really do think flourishing pertains to all aspects of life. This is important personally, of course, but I think we need to bring it into research. We need to bring these frameworks into policy. We need better research support in terms of government funding, university hiring, and so on and so forth for a broader set of outcomes. We study income and health very well, and these are important, but people care about more than that. They care about being happy, having a sense of meaning and purpose, trying to be a good person, about their relationships. We should be looking at these other outcomes with the same level of attention and empirical rigor. I think employers, medical centers, schools, universities should start tracking flourishing over time. Government should be doing this as well, not just focusing on GDP. I very much believe what we measure shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, and the policies put in place to achieve those aims. We should be aiming at flourishing personally and as a community. And again, the research itself points to some of what we need to do. We need to better support the flourishing of young people in subsequent generations. We need new models of economic development that prioritize the development of the whole person, that don't compromise meaning, character, and relationships. We need to support familial, religious, educational, and workplace pathways to flourishing. I think we need to promote flourishing globally for all people in all contexts. We need to move from the global flourishing study to the global flourishing movement. That's promotion of flourishing for all. I'll close there and then open things up for further discussion on envisioning the future. But thank you all.
Thank you, Tyler. Just a few comments before we open it up for questions. It seems like we can never get caught up. We're finishing up Wave 2 papers. Wave 3 data just became available this week, and we're getting ready to go into the field for Wave 4. So it never ends, and it's also very exciting. And a brief conversation about Wave 4. One of the blind spots of the Global Flourishing Study is that we don't have the time in 22 minutes to ask people questions that we would like for them just to take their time and answer, Are you struggling with anything in your life right now that you'd like to tell us about? We don't have time for that. It's a 22-minute call or a 22-minute interview. And this last year I was talking to John in Washington, and I was asking him, what's the latest thing that you're working on with AI? And he was telling me. And he said, there's some exciting things that we're experimenting with that we think have real potential. And so we started talking about it. And so in Wave 4, we will be doing AI-assisted in-depth interviews with a subsample of the overall sample. And these will be 45-minute interviews that will, and we're building the script for it right now. So this is something that we hadn't planned on that's going to be very exciting to give us insights that are rich, that are important, and will eliminate one of the weaknesses of the study. So that's a new development, John, that I'm excited about. I remember when you and I were talking about it, you said, well, Byron, are you asking me a question or are you giving me an order? And I go, I'm giving you an order? And so here we are a few months later. It looks like it's within reach, John.
It's really, really wild where the future of survey research is going because of AI. To the point where you could see a day where there could be a complete end to close-ended surveys. Now, what do I mean by that? Of course, when you get a phone call and somebody's interviewing you and they say, do you approve or disapprove the job performance of the leader of your country, or rate your life on a scale of 0 to 10? You could see a day because of AI where a phone call just says, tell us about politics in your country. Tell us how your life is going. Because now AI can analyze all of that text, and if you think about where it's going in the future, they can also capture the speed at which you respond, how fast your words come, your locution, your diction, everything. And it could give a precise estimate on how you'd rate your life. And by the way, it does not take long to know if people approve or disapprove of the president. Heck, when Gallup used to call, they would just go, angrily shout political things as a response. Do you see what I mean? But AI is moving things forward so quickly that it's going to revolutionize how surveys are done in the first place. And I'll just throw one last thing because I find this so fascinating. There was a paper published, actually the first time I heard of it was you sent it to me. And it was done by June Park at Stanford because they were training digital twins. They took, I think, 2,000 humans and interviewed them for 2.5 hours, unstructured interviews. Just said, tell us how your life is, what do you do for a living, where are you from, what movies do you like, all that kind of stuff. And they used that 2.5 hours of text to train digital twins. Then what they did to experiment is to see how accurately can those digital twins predict what those flesh and blood humans will say on an interview. So then they gave him, some kind of 20-minute interview. Do you know how accurate the digital twins were? How accurate they could guess what the flesh and blood humans would say on an interview? You want to get any guesses? 85% accurate. They could hit it with 85% accuracy. Think about that, which now gets very deeply philosophical. How complex is the human mind that AI in its modern form can deconstruct our thought process in just 2.5 hours? It's frightening. Also makes you kind of wonder, do we have free will if we're so predictable? Anyway, but those very issues are things that we need to think about, because in a very short amount of time, we can capture so much information that we didn't even know how to analyze previously, and now we can. So anyway, I think it's really exciting where all this is going.
I am likewise very excited about the AI-assisted interviews and having the qualitative data. What does flourishing mean to you? And having an understanding of that across contexts. And I do think it will revolutionize data collection. I'm more skeptical that we'll abandon the close-ended questions. And I do think it's interesting what is in that 15%. What are we missing if we rely entirely on AI? And will AI ever be able to overcome some of the hallucinations? So I think the potential for AI is extraordinary, but I for one, will always be pushing. Also coming back to the actual numerical responses from a research perspective. But I think the possibilities for having both together really are extraordinary. And once again, we are deeply grateful to Gallup for building this sort of infrastructure.
Well, and to be clear, I don't think this will happen, in the next 3 years. I also agree with you from an analytics perspective. The method on which I meant the end of the closed-ended question, but not the actual end state, which you'd be looking at quantitative, because, this is kind of, I think some have called it qualitative quantitative economics, something like that. But basically, you just use the qual to arrive at your quant. But I agree with you. I don't know that this is going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years, but in the next 30, I don't know if when George Gallup started knocking on doors in the United States in 1935, if somebody ever would have asked him, you think he'll send an email? You know where that's going. What would he have said back? What's an email? Mm-hmm. So to be in the mindset of where things are going to go in the next 3 decades, you've got to leave the mindset that we're in today.
So, John, just to give them a little bit of a tiny glimpse of where this in-depth interview could take us, tell the story of the woman that was interviewed and was asked about life satisfaction.
Okay, yeah. So in this pursuit of understanding a great life, one of the things that we were testing many years ago is we would ask the 3-part questions was 0 to 10, how's your life 5 years ago, where is it today, and where will it be in 5 years? And so there was a woman in Kyrgyzstan that was being interviewed, and our colleague was sitting there with her, and she said, scale 0 to 10, 0 is the worst imaginable life, 10 is the best imaginable life. Where were you 5 years ago? She said a 2. Now 2 is very low. The lowest we have ever seen for a country average was Afghanistan, the last time we were able to do it 2 years after the U.S. forces left. We've never seen a country average that low. So a 2 is very low. Then, of course, the next question was, where do you think your life is today? And she said a 2. I mean, now your kind of breath is getting taken away. And she said to her, where do you think you'll be in 5 years? And she said a 10. Now, we can't interrupt the interview as it's going on, but of course you can't help but wonder, what in the heck is that? And so at the very end, that's where you can, and by the way, having our colleague in the room, these are purely research. This doesn't go into the final database, but she looked at her and she said, sis, 2, 2, 10, what's up? And she said, I'm pregnant. I'm going to have a boy. But she saw everything through her future, that everything was going to change just because of that baby boy. And I think there's 2 things that it reminds us. One, a great life to everyone is very personal. What's a great life to me, to you, is going to be very different than, somebody in Kyrgyzstan. But on the other hand, and I think this is the genius of what these 2 have been working on, we also have a lot in common. Wow. How many moms felt that? So I think that's what's so amazing about this, is that we're bringing, these very human things to life, but we're doing so at a scale that is just absolutely remarkable. And these are not just numbers, they're stories like that woman had.
I'm going to ask you two a question. I'd like you both to answer. And then maybe after that, we'll let people come to the microphones and just throw it wide open for questions. When Templeton said they were going to help us get this project funded, they said there's one requirement. It has to be an open access project. And we said, can we negotiate this? Because we were kind of hopeful that we could have a first shot at the data for 3 to 5 years before the data became public. And they said, there's no negotiating. It will be an open access project. And now, 3 years later, of course, we're thrilled that they required that of us, and for a number of reasons. But I'd like for John to say a word about why it's so important for this to be an open access project, and then I'd like for Tyler to also weigh in.
Oh, well, I was going to go somewhere else with that one, but Byron makes a really good point. Right now, I can't even believe this happens. I thought one of the last institutions that would never succumb to challenges of trust would be academia. And yet here we are. And, now they've looked at all these papers that have been published in journals, and they find there's an estimate now, they think that 2% of them have data that has just been falsified or completely made up. They had a group that went through and called some of the academics and said, can we get that data? We want to see if we can replicate it. And apparently, I think this was in The Economist, they said, termites ate my laptop. Which, how ironic that we're still giving the same excuses that we gave in high school or college, and that even when we become tenured professors, we're still giving the same excuses. But now there are these paper mills in Egypt and India where you can hire somebody and they'll basically write a paper for you. But in the process, they fudge the data. Something's wrong with it, or they just make it up. In fact, one of the places where it happened where it was the worst was in an ethics department. Can you imagine the irony that the ethics department is publishing papers and they make the data up? And so one of the things that's so amazing about this is these two go, check our homework, here's the data. The entire world can now look at it, scrutinize it in any way that they want. And so I think it's one of the reasons it was Nature that, Byron, I think you were hoping that you could get one paper in, and now what is it, 100 that you're aspiring to get in there or something?
I do think that open access was a feature that really helped us with the Nature editors when they saw the scope of the project and that it was going to be open access, that everybody would have access to all of our coding and syntax. It kind of pretty much eliminates the possibility, because if you fake the data, you're going to be caught now. Tyler?
Can I say one other
Yeah.
quick thing? I think the other beautiful thing is that these two, what humility for both of them to say, maybe when we mine the data, we'll miss something. So let anyone else take a look at it as well. It's amazing to me. I don't know if you guys saw that thing where the scrolls that were destroyed by, what was it, Mount Vesuvius, or what was the name? And anyway, somebody actually used AI and they cracked the code on it and they actually read it, even though despite that lava ruined the things. Anyway, you look and you go, who the heck did that? Who figured out how to do that? It was a college kid at the University of Nebraska. I thought it was a rocket scientist at NASA or something, that some guy that's got 4 PhDs that was, I don't know, did it as a kind of a fun thing and finally cracked it. It wasn't. And so I think what these two are also saying is throwing a lot of this out to the world to say, what else can we find? What other discoveries are possible?
Yeah, I mean, I would point to that as one of the chief advantages, and there have been, I think now, 20, 30 different groups around the world making use of this data, and I think that's only going to increase, and we've certainly learned from their work. So from the perspective of kind of advancing knowledge and the pursuit of flourishing, I think this is really a wonderful thing. And then also, the world today in 2026 is different than it was in 2018 when we started. And I think the open science movement has been a good one for research in this field and in others. And I think that question of replication and falsifiability really is critical. But today, many of the journals are requiring this anyway. So in many ways, it's made our lives easier than it would have been, and it's empowered so much of this research. Just have one quick final question for John, and then maybe we can open it up. But I mean, Gallup has been an incredible partner in this. I mean, this study is just inconceivable without Gallup. And when Bryon first kind of brought the idea, I really did think it was pie in the sky that this would never and could never happen. Both what's been done with the Global Flourishing Study and with the Gallup World Poll do seem from the perspective of a individual researcher almost inconceivable. And I don't think there's anything analogous really to the World Poll. What has given Gallup its capacity, its strength, its success? How has that infrastructure been built? Was this just hard work and dedication? Do you feel there's some other secret ingredient here, or how did this come about? It has been amazing to partner with you, but also amazing just to watch what is possible.
I think it's two things. I mean, at our core, and two of our kind of founding fathers, if you will, George Gallup, and another one, I don't know if any of you have ever taken StrengthsFinder, also known as Clifton Strengths, which was created by a guy named Don Clifton, who was actually my grandfather. But both of them shared one thing: is at their core they were researchers, and I think they also knew. This is the other thing, is that everyone that's ever joined Gallup is we're attracted to doing things that are mission based and have a chance to truly change the world. And so we go into it also knowing that, look, these are very hard projects. They're very difficult. But no matter what happens, we're going to learn a lot. And we can share those learnings with the world. We sometimes we go out. We've done surveys in countries where we invested a lot of money, and I am not kidding you. It was a bust. And you look back and you go, oh my gosh, what did you... But we learned something from it. And if we can share those learnings with each other and the world, then it was not done in vain, or it was not done, as a waste or anything. And so truly we go into it going, this is ambitious, but why not? I mean, we're going to learn something in the process no matter what. So that's the spirit that we all share.
Maybe we could open it up for questions, either microphone on either side.
Hello, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. So as an oral historian who is editing a volume on AI applications, my ears perk up when I hear AI-assisted interviewing. So there's probably a million questions I can ask, but I'll just limit it to this one. For this tool that you're planning, is it going to be an interactive interviewer, or is it simply going to kind of go question 1 through question 10, allow for open-ended questions to be answered at length up to 45 minutes?
Well, I'll let John talk, but we've done some demos with it already, and so you're asking a question, and as you're asking the question and they're responding, in real time, you're seeing the transcript. Mm-hmm. And depending on how you answer that question, the follow-up comes after that.
So it is interactive.
Oh yeah, it's interactive, and it would be one thing to ask you. Let's say you answer a 2 on a question, and that AI is perked because you asked and they responded with the two. So one of the things that we're talking about, and you could argue for the next 6 weeks, we're going to be working on this script. Would we want to ask something after that? So when you're going through the flourishing questions, would we want to ask right there, or would we want to wait and find another convenient spot to ask a follow-up question? But yes, interactive, and so when you're watching the demo, it's fast because AI knows how to slow you down if you're going too fast, or to speed you up if you're taking too much time, such that maybe a human wouldn't have been able to do that quite as well. And if you don't answer the question, then AI comes back and rephrases the question to you again. So to make sure that you really do get a chance to answer that question. So in some ways, this is what you and I were talking about a year ago, is that AI may be in some ways better than having an actual human to do this interview. So
Okay.
I hope that helps a little bit. John, anything else?
Right now, we're exploring. If you kind of think of it as like IVR plus, you know, like the old robo calls that you had, it's getting closer there, but we are testing at speed this adaptive approach that I think both of you are talking about. And when I say adaptive, it's on the phone and it's on web. And when I say phone, it's not just to households, it's also in workplaces. In fact, we are experimenting with an adaptive technique where, you know, like traditional employee surveys, where it is a lot more interactive, this adaptive approach. But second, if they feel more comfortable, they can actually call in this workplace to have a conversation and to share their real thoughts about what's happening. And then we ingest the data, and then we can make sense of it, anonymize it as well to make sure that nothing gets back if they're saying something that they don't want, you know, of course, to be heard. So there's a number of things that we're testing. The biggest, the two challenges that we have right now are sometimes it doesn't go off script where it hallucinates, but like just might miss a beat, and then languages. Languages is a massive, massive problem right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you for that answer, and I'll just say we value silence in oral history interviews, so don't speed them up too much.
Thank you so much for speaking today, guys. I had a quick question about like biases. So when you talk about a global study, you have people of different education levels and knowledge levels. Do people judge what they know based on their environment, understanding, and knowledge? Is someone, physical health, I would say, is the easiest one when I was listening. If someone's never been to a formalized institution or educational system, they might think a very human, very healthy human body physically is based on their community, what the healthiest person is. How do you account for that and address that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and one which we have to face on a pretty much daily basis. Unquestionably, there are differences in interpretation and understanding of these questions. Some of that is because of translation and the 40 languages that are part of the Global Flourishing study, but some of it's also cultural. And there can be complicated patterns where evidence in Japan, for example, that on a 0 to 10 scale are more likely to want to report towards the middle of the scale so as not to exaggerate or boast. And so that needs to be taken into account. That's not all that's going on with Japan, because when we just ask yes-no questions, do you have a close friend to talk to about important matters? They also have the lowest percentage of yeses across the 22 countries. So it's not just that, but that is part of the explanation. And then as you were suggesting, people may have different comparison points. One of the most striking results, and this is only in the United States of the 22 countries, is that if you ask about self-rated physical health, in the United States, that's also increasing with age. We don't see that anywhere else. But I mean, what does that mean? And probably some of it is an assessment with regard to what they were expecting their health to be like for their stage. So all of that does need to be taken into account in interpretation. It also makes comparisons across countries more challenging. How we've principally handled it is essentially to treat the Global Flourishing study as 22 separate studies, where we're trying to understand the dynamics of flourishing and well-being separately in each of the 22 countries. Yes, identify what's universal and what's culturally or country specific, but by saying we're not making definitive claims that these questions are being understood identically, we're able to look, I think, in a much more accurate way with results within country.
I've been asked that question many times in a lot of different ways. There are statistical techniques that you can do as well, like it's called demean it, and basically weight it by whatever subcategory that you want to kind of even out whatever you think that variance might be. But sometimes when that takes place, I always kind of scratch my head and wonder, or is there something valuable that we're actually measuring to make sure that we don't actually weight whatever that is out? And I'll give you an example. So one of the things that we try and measure in 140 countries on the Gallup World Poll is what we call positive affect. So we ask people, did you smile and laugh a lot yesterday? Did you experience a lot of enjoyment? And there's one region of the world that's just way higher than the rest. You want to guess which one it is?
The U.S.
Latin America.
Oh.
Nobody expresses more joy in the world than Latin America. And every time we report that, somebody goes, well, isn't that because Latinos are kind of, more positive? Isn't there a way to wait for that, to kind of weight it down or whatever? And I always think to myself, maybe that's the finding. The fact that they're actually saying life is so good despite the fact that wealth is so much lower in many of those countries. In the Dominican Republic, they're in the bottom quartile of GDP per capita. But when you look at positive emotions, they're in the top quartile. Wow. Is that the finding? Because what is it that's happening there that despite poverty, that they can laugh and smile as much as they do? And so I do think we have to be careful. And what you're saying, though, is an issue in all data collection. A lot of times people, I think, when they talk to Gallup, I think they think that we're kind of getting soft data, and they're like, you kind of really get the hard data or whatever. And I always say to them, what's hard data? And they say to me, like unemployment. And I feel like they should know that they're about to walk into a trap door with that one, because then I say to them, how's unemployment measured? And I can hear them stuttering, because I think, well, you took an interest in how we're measuring things. How come you've never taken an interest in how unemployment's measured? Unemployment is a 60,000 person survey in the United States done once a month. So when CNN comes out or Axios or whoever and says 5.4% of Americans are unemployed, survey. Now, of course, the questions that are asked are not mood. They're, do you have a job? Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics takes an hour and a half in order to understand whether or not you're employed or not. But still, even GDP has underlying survey research data where you're doing establishment surveys, going to employers and asking them various questions about their business, which might be subject to a bias. And so, anyway, I just think some of the questions about, the underlying data, even GDP, for example, there are a lot of people, there's a huge scrutiny under the Obama administration on, are we measuring the right thing? We've been doing that for 90 years, and we're still not entirely sure if GDP is measured perfectly. None of us are. So I think it's, in short, to say you're asking exactly the right question. But for every piece of data that you ever see, they face some of the same challenges.
Thank you. Over here.
So thanks a lot. A great presentation. I have a question about the data. So are all of the countries similar curves in terms of the data? Are you seeing a typical bell curve? Are you seeing bimodal in some of these where perhaps rather than a Likert score, some sort of a net promoter score would give you a better assessment of how it is that we're analyzing the data? And how are you then accounting for that when you talk about which countries best is wrong. Which country's got the highest score? That's the highest mean score, but if you look at it from a net promoter perspective or something, they may be much lower, and that we're perhaps undercounting that population in that country. I just offer, without having an opportunity to look at all the data, I think that it's incredibly fascinating to try and analyze that across 22 different countries against all these questions. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, with regard to the reporting, yeah, we're reporting means. We're also reporting standard deviations, Gini coefficients. We have some statisticians who are doing other things with the data as well, and it's open access. So if you want to provide other summaries or assessments, that is certainly possible. With regard to the distribution, I mean, our analyses that we're using typically are robust to those distributional assumptions, but with regard to the actual description of the distribution, in many countries you do see something, roughly bell curve, usually with a longer tail, because if the mean is 7.4, for example, there are still more individuals who are reporting a 5 or a 3, but in many countries it doesn't look all that dissimilar from something, roughly bell-shaped curve. I would say the most prominent exceptions are in some countries you do get a handful of respondents, and we knew this going in from Gallup's prior work on these 0 to 10 questions, but you do get a number of respondents who seem to be using only response categories 0, 5, and 10, are almost treating it as 3 levels, and so yeah, not in all, but you'll sometimes see, in addition to the bell curve, small spikes at 0, 5, and 10.
All right, thanks.
Yes.
Hello. So I know you guys, like you said, you're going to these different countries, interviewing all these people. I guess my question is, if and when you guys are able to determine these determining factors of why people aren't flourishing across these different areas, how do you guys, I guess, plan to go back and address those issues? Is it going to be like a countrywide thing? Are you going to meet the individual needs of each and every person, which I know can be very difficult considering there's over 200,000 people? Like, what exactly is that going to look like?
Well, I'll go first. I mean, you're asking policy question there, I think. What kind of policies or interventions are needed to address the findings? Mm-hmm. Those kinds of questions we were expecting to get after Wave 3 data were published. We started getting them right after the first wave of papers with Wave 1. That's why there'll need to be so many more people that will enter this discussion. Our calling, we feel, is to write the papers, to present the findings, and then welcome the policy discussions as they come. As Tyler said, how can you think about doing economic development in countries where the poverty level is problematic? But how do you do so without jeopardizing those areas of flourishing where they're actually exemplary? Mm-hmm. And then in the US, you could argue we're not doing well in some of those same domains that they're doing well. So what is it that we can learn from other countries? And then how can you think about interventions that we would put in place here? And I think the panel right before ours was one that was addressing that issue for young people and social media. What are the things, the next steps? So we may not be the best persons to answer those questions, but we certainly want to be able to provide data for people to ponder those policy relevant questions. Tyler?
Yeah, no, I think to do this well, it really does need to be at the country level. And that's why in every single one of our papers in an online supplement, we give all of the results by country and generally offer some comment on the cross-country variation. So even though the main results might be aggregating over the 22 countries, I do think the country-specific analyses really are important for policy purposes. To facilitate that, we're also doing a separate special collection with the International Journal of Wellbeing on reports in each specific country. So while each of our papers looks at a particular construct, whether that's going to be hope or meaning in life or relationships, we're also changing the lens with this second special collection, looking at all of those different factors within Israel, within Turkey, within Japan, and so on and so forth. And we've found groups of researchers within each of the 22 countries to lead those papers so that there's more of a voice within that country on this data. And we have seen interest from some countries. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Indonesia took particular interest in the results and had a conversation with about 200 academics and policymakers from Indonesia, engaging with the data and expressing appreciation, but also some, I think, healthy skepticism with regard to what they said were objective economic and developmental issues that they were struggling with, and so good conversation on the objective versus the subjective aspects of well-being, but also insights for us. We found one of the strongest relationships between retrospective assessments of relationship with mother and subsequent well-being as an adult. And so I pointed this out, and they said, oh yeah, that makes sense. Here mothers will often carry around their child physically on their body for 6 or 9 months following birth. And so it gave incredible context and insight into some of what was going on there. So I think not only does the research help inform policy, but I think those questions around policy and engaging at the country level gives considerable insight into the research as well.
Thank you. Stephen Sloan, where are you? Okay, one more question? Okay.
Thank you, guys. So you mentioned that the activity of measurement itself has an effect sometimes, and you mentioned the difficulty, or really the impossibility of following up in open-ended ways to try to figure out sort of background information that might be interesting. And that leads me to wonder about the extent to which it's possible and desirable to ascertain how participants in the surveys are understanding the very activity of being asked these questions. What is this activity of measurement? What's being measured? Whose metrics of flourishing are being assessed? From the point of view of various different kinds of religious and philosophical cultural background. I could imagine, for instance, if I'm an adherent to the Advaita Vedanta tradition of Hinduism, on which we're all a collective consciousness and individuality is an illusion, and transcending that is the ultimate source of meaning and purpose. Or if I'm a non-self Buddhist and I'm sort of part way along the path of divesting myself from attachments to desires and to other people. You might imagine these metrics diverging in what would turn out to be unsurprising ways. How am I doing on meaning and purpose? Well, a lot better. How am I doing on attachments with other people? Lots fewer of them. I'm doing great. Are there ways of accounting for the differences in philosophical and religious background that might give rise to different understandings of what's being measured, whose flourishing is being measured? How important is that?
Well, I'll let each of the other guys weigh in on this, but we did cognitive interviews in all the countries where we not only did the survey with people, we then talked to them afterward. This is what we were talking about earlier, where we wanted to know if the questions made sense. If any of these questions didn't make sense, why didn't they make sense? And so this is also a part of the whole translation process. So such words like maybe belonging or words like forgiveness are sometimes difficult to translate, but when you're doing the cognitive interviewing, some of these things come out. And so we had to tweak things as a result of the cognitive interviewing. I think some people were surprised. So there's a lot of Buddhists, there's a lot of Hindus in our study. And Indonesia, as you know, came out on top, which is a Muslim majority country. So it appears that people are understanding the kinds of things that we're asking, but I'll let others weigh in too.
I mean, I would go back to comment that John made, which is that, some of these things we don't want to explain away. Some of these things are, part of the story, what is giving rise to higher levels of meaning. Unquestionably, those, religious or philosophical or cultural frameworks are also going to shape the interpretation. It's not just the experience, but as you were saying, the interpretation of it as well. And that's some of what we're trying to get at with the cognitive interviews. Well, the cognitive interviews were in part carried out to identify questions where maybe we needed a little bit of further tweaking with the translation. They're of interest, of intrinsic interest in their own right. And so we have a few papers on those interviews, and you can see that for some questions, not all, but for some questions, there are notable differences in how the questions themselves are going to be understood. There's no way to address that perfectly. One does one's best, but then I think one takes it into account in the interpretation of those results. But in some ways, some of that is of considerable interest, again, in its own right. It helps fill in the picture of how flourishing is being understood. And that's why, while the research provides and can provide tremendous insight, we shouldn't just stay with the research. We should engage with the communities, with communal understandings of well-being, and should try to promote flourishing in all of these different contexts and forms.
Let's thank Byron, John, and Tyler again for their presentation.